Could you ever imagine a world where your future was decided for you, where your voice in legal matters was barely a whisper, and where your very honor was considered someone else's property? What if the laws governing your daily life were not about your freedom, but about restricting it, about controlling your choices, your possessions, and even your body? Welcome to Anglo-Saxon England in 700 AD. Number 7. The control of a woman's legal standing through mund. Imagine this. You are a young woman in 700 AD Anglo-Saxon England, living in a small village nestled among rolling green hills. Your daily life revolves around the rhythms of the seasons, the tasks of the household, and the close-knit community that surrounds you. But lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly simple existence is a powerful, invisible force that dictates much of your reality, the concept of mund. This was not just a societal norm, it was a deep-seated legal principle, one that acted as a profound restriction on the lives of Anglo-Saxon women. Mund essentially meant guardianship or protection, but it came with a significant caveat. A woman, from the moment she was born until the day she died, was almost always under the mund of a man. Think about what that truly meant for a young girl. Her father held her mund. He was her legal representative, her protector, and the one who made decisions on her behalf. If she needed to engage in any sort of legal transaction, if she was wronged, or if she was accused of wrongdoing, it was her father who would stand for her in the fledgling courts or before the local assembly. She did not possess an independent legal identity in the same way a man did. Her legal existence was, in essence, an extension of her male guardians. This might sound protective on the surface, like a father shielding his daughter, but the reality was far more nuanced and, for the woman, often restrictive. It meant a constant lack of agency, a perpetual state of being overseen and spoken for. When a woman married, her mund transferred from her father to her husband. This was not a casual shift. It was a fundamental change in her legal guardianship. Her husband now became the one responsible for her actions, and for her legal representation. If she were to buy or sell something, it would typically be under her husband's name or with his explicit permission. If someone wronged her, the legal redress would often be sought by her husband, and any compensation or fines might be paid to him as the owner of her mund, so to speak. This system was not just about the idea of a husband protecting his wife. It was about defining her legal status through her relationship with a man. Without a male guardian, a woman's ability to interact with the legal system, to own property independently, or to even make basic contractual agreements was severely limited, if not impossible. Even in situations where a woman might appear to have some power, such as a widowed mother managing her deceased husband's estate, her authority often still derived from her status as a guardian for her children, or was subject to the oversight of her husband's male relatives. A widow's mund might revert to her father or brother, or in some cases the king or the local lord might assert a form of guardianship over her, especially if she held significant property. This wasn't an arbitrary rule. It was deeply embedded in the social and legal fabric of Anglo-Saxon society. Scholars of early English law often highlight how this concept of mund permeated every aspect of a woman's interaction with the outside world, creating a framework where her individual actions were almost always mediated through a male figure. Consider the gravity of this restriction. It meant that a woman could not, on her own initiative, bring a lawsuit against someone who had wronged her. She could not, independently, enter into a binding contract for a piece of land or a valuable animal. Her word, without the endorsement of her male guardian, carried little weight in formal settings. This system, while perhaps designed to maintain social order and protect women in a harsh world, fundamentally stripped them of independent legal personhood. It created a world where a woman's legal rights and responsibilities were not truly her own, but rather a reflection of the man to whom she was bound by blood or marriage. This enduring concept of mund was one of the most pervasive and defining restrictions on Anglo-Saxon women in 700, and shaping their lives from birth to grave in ways that are difficult for us to fully grasp today. It was a constant reminder that their legal existence was secondary, always tethered to the authority of a male protector. Number 6. Lack of independent property. Rights upon marriage. Imagine you're a young woman living in 700 AD, perhaps the daughter of a prosperous farmer or even a minor noble. You might inherit land or valuable goods from your own family. You might possess fine garments, intricate jewelry, or a dowry of precious items intended for your future. These are your possessions, things you have grown up with, perhaps even things you feel a deep connection to. The moment you marry, the legal landscape surrounding these possessions shifts dramatically, often in ways that disempower you. This was not merely a cultural tradition, it was a pervasive legal reality that deeply restricted a woman's economic autonomy. When a woman married in Anglo-Saxon England, around 700, a significant portion of her property, particularly land, would often transfer into her husband's control. While her dowry, known as fultum or morgingifu in some contexts, was hers to bring to the marriage and might be considered her distinct contribution to the union, the practical management and legal ownership of combined assets largely fell under the husband's domain. He became the household's head, the one with the legal authority to manage and dispose of the family's wealth. This meant that while a wife might have a strong influence within the household economy, making decisions about daily provisions or managing servants, her ability to independently sell land, engage in major financial transactions, or make significant investments without entirely absent. Consider the practical implications of this. If you had inherited a small plot of land from your mother once you were married, your husband would become the legal steward of that land. He would decide what to plant, when to sell its produce, and whether to lease or even dispose of it. Your voice in such matters, while perhaps heard within the domestic sphere, carried little legal weight in the broader community. The law, as understood at the time, tended to consolidate the family's economic power within the male head of the household. This was not necessarily about a husband being malicious or uncaring. It was simply the accepted legal framework of the time, designed to ensure that the family unit had a clear, single figure, responsible for its economic dealings. However, it wasn't an absolute void of rights for women. Anglo-Saxon law did recognize certain entitlements for women, particularly around the concept of dower or morginfu, the morning gift, given to the bride by the groom after the wedding night. This gift, which often included land or other valuable assets, was explicitly intended for her, and she would typically retain it if her husband died. It was a form of financial security for her widowhood. Yet, even with the morgingifu during the marriage itself, the husband still held significant control over its management and use. The dower was hers in principle, but its administration often remained with him as the legal head of the family, or was subject to his oversight. Furthermore, a woman's ability to write a will or dispose of property independently was complex and often restricted. While there is evidence that some women, particularly widows or women who became nuns and abbesses, could own and manage property, their circumstances were often exceptions to the general rule. For the vast majority of married women, their economic independence was deeply curtailed by the legal framework that subsumed their property rights under their husband's authority. This created a scenario where a woman, regardless of her birth or wealth, became financially dependent on her husband upon marriage. This dependency wasn't just theoretical. It had profound daily implications, influencing her status within the community, her ability to make independent choices, and her overall sense of personal autonomy. Transfer of property control upon marriage was a cornerstone of legal restrictions on Anglo-Saxon women in 700 AD, profoundly shaping their economic lives. Number 5. Marriage as a contractual exchange with limited female consent. Imagine a world where your future, your lifelong partner, and even your children's destinies are decided not by your heart, but by the strategic calculations of your father, your family, and perhaps even powerful lords. This was the reality for many Anglo-Saxon women around 700 AD, where marriage was less about romantic love as we understand it today, and more about a carefully orchestrated contractual exchange. While love and affection might grow within a marriage, the initial arrangement was often driven by pragmatic considerations of wealth, alliance, and status. And a woman's personal consent, if considered at all, was frequently secondary to these larger family and community interests. In Anglo-Saxon society, marriage was a crucial tool for securing alliances between powerful families, consolidating landholdings, and ensuring the continuation of important lineages. A daughter was often seen as a valuable asset in these negotiations, a bond of peace and a means of extending influence. The process began not with a proposal to the woman, but with negotiations between the prospective groom and the bride's male guardian, typically her father. These negotiations were serious, involving detailed discussions about the bride price or wergild, paid to the bride's family, the dowry or morgangifi the bride would receive from the groom, and other financial agreements designed to secure the economic stability of the new union. The woman herself often had little to no direct say in these arrangements. While it's plausible that a woman might express a strong dislike for a particular suitor, or that her father might consider her feelings to some extent, the legal and social weight of the decision rested squarely with the male head of the family. The idea of a woman choosing her own husband for love was largely foreign to the legal and social norms of the time. Her role was to accept the arrangement that her family had deemed most beneficial, not just for her but for the entire family unit. To refuse a well-negotiated match could be seen as an act of rebellion, potentially jeopardizing her family's standing and future prospects. This lack of direct consent was a significant restriction. It meant that a woman's personal desires and affections were largely irrelevant when it came to one of the most monumental decisions of her life. She was, in essence, a pawn in a larger game of social and economic maneuvering. The marriage ceremony itself, while often involving religious blessings and communal feasts, formally sealed an agreement made between two male parties regarding the transfer of a woman from one mund to another, from the authority of her father to that of her husband. The act of giving away the bride during the ceremony was a literal representation of this transfer of guardianship and responsibility. Consider the feelings this might evoke: a sense of powerlessness, of being an object of exchange rather than a person with autonomous choices. While some women might have been fortunate to marry someone they grew to love and respect, the fundamental framework of marriage as a strategic contract meant that their personal happiness was not the primary driver of the union. Even if the law did not explicitly forbid a woman from voicing her opinion, the overwhelming social pressure and the legal structure of the time effectively limited her agency. This emphasis on marriage as a contractual family-driven arrangement with limited regard for the woman's consent was a profound and pervasive restriction on Anglo-Saxon women in 700 and shaping their personal lives and destinies in ways that are hard to comprehend in our modern era of individual choice. Number 4. Harsher consequences for female adultery. Imagine a situation where the consequences for the same action are drastically different, depending on your gender, where transgression for one is a mild inconvenience, but for the other, it means public humiliation, severe physical punishment. This was the stark reality for Anglo-Saxon women in 700 AD when it came to the offense of adultery. While the legal and social codes of the time certainly frowned upon adultery for both men and women, the penalties and societal repercussions for a woman who committed adultery were far more brutal and devastating than those faced by a man. This gender disparity in punishment was a deeply entrenched restriction, reflecting a patriarchal society's intense focus on female chastity and the purity of lineage. For a man, adultery, though certainly not condoned, might result in a fine, a payment to the wronged husband, or perhaps a minor loss of standing within the community. While a man might be seen as having dishonored his wife, the transgression did not carry the same profound social and legal weight as a woman's infidelity. His actions did not, in the eyes of the law, threaten the legitimacy of his children or the clarity of inheritance. The concept of a man's property rights and his lineage was paramount, and a woman's adultery directly imperiled that. For a woman, however, the consequences of adultery were catastrophic. The law, as interpreted through customs and emerging codes like those of King Ethelbert or Inn, viewed female adultery not just as a moral failing, but as a severe legal crime that directly undermined the husband's honor, his property rights, and the legitimacy of his heirs. A husband had the legal right to punish his adulterous wife, and these punishments could be extreme. Historical accounts and legal codes, while often referring to later periods, infer a harsh standard for this era. It was not uncommon for an adulterous wife to be publicly shamed, often through forced exposure, where she might be stripped naked and driven through the village, enduring the scorn and ridicule of the community. This was a deliberate act of public humiliation, designed to brand her as an outcast and to serve as a stark warning to others. Beyond public shaming, physical mutilation was a very real possibility. Some accounts suggest that an adulterous woman could be subjected to the cutting off of her nose or ears, a permanent disfigurement that would mark her for life, making her a constant visual reminder of her transgression. This was not merely about punishment. It was about stripping her of her attractiveness, her social standing, and her ability to ever fully reintegrate into respectable society. In some severe cases, particularly if the husband was powerful and the perceived offense egregious, the adulterous wife could even face death at her husband's hands. While the law might specify limitations on a husband's right to kill his wife, the general societal tolerance for harsh retribution against female infidelity meant that such acts might go unpunished or be treated with considerable leniency. Furthermore, an adulterous woman would almost certainly be repudiated by her husband. She would lose her status, her home, her children, and any property or dowry she had brought to the marriage. She would be cast out often with nowhere to go and no means of support, becoming a social pariah. Her chances of remarriage would be virtually non-existent, and her future would be bleak. This stark contrast in punishment highlights one of the most severe legal restrictions on Anglo-Saxon women in 700 AD. Demonstrates how a woman's value was intrinsically linked to her chastity and her role in producing legitimate heirs, and how any deviation from this expectation was met with devastating and often violent consequences, ensuring control over female sexuality and lineage at all costs. Number 3. Limited public role and exclusion from legal and political assemblies. Imagine living in a society where important decisions about your community, your land, and your future are made in public gatherings, but you simply because you are a woman are largely excluded from participating. You might be a witness to the events, observing from the periphery, but your voice is not sought, your opinion is not weighed, and your presence is not legally required. This was the pervasive reality for Anglo-Saxon women in 700 AD concerning their public role and their exclusion from legal and political assemblies. While women certainly held vital roles within their households and communities, their access to formal power structures and the broader public sphere was severely curtailed by custom and law. In Anglo-Saxon England, significant decisions about land, justice, and community governance were made in assemblies known as wittenagements at a higher level, or in local moots at a more regional or village level. These were the arenas where laws were discussed, disputes were settled, and leaders were chosen or affirmed. They were essentially the heart of the Anglo-Saxon legal and political system. However, these assemblies were overwhelmingly, almost exclusively, male domains. Men of property, free men, and noblemen would gather, debate, and render judgments. A woman, regardless of her intelligence, her wealth, or her personal influence, was generally not expected, nor legally permitted, to participate in these formal proceedings as a full member. Think about the implications of this exclusion. If a woman had a grievance, if her property rights were being infringed upon, or if she needed legal redress, she could not typically represent herself. As discussed earlier, her male guardian, her father, husband, or brother, would have to speak for her. Her testimony, if required, might be heard, but it would often be filtered through the male voice representing her. This meant that women were fundamentally disenfranchised from the formal legal processes that governed their lives. They could be subjects of the law affected by its rulings, but not active participants in its creation or enforcement. This created a barrier to justice and agency that was deeply ingrained in the societal structure. This restriction extended beyond legal moots to the broader political landscape. Women did not hold public office, serve as legal administrators, or act as official representatives of their communities in a political sense. While powerful noblewomen and queens could certainly wield influence behind the scenes, advising their husbands or sons, their power was informal and derived from their familial connections, not from an independent political right or office. For instance, a queen might be a formidable force within the royal household, managing resources and advising her king, but she would not typically sit in a wittenamat as an official member, voting on laws or declaring war. The only significant exception to this general rule was the realm of the church, particularly for aristocratic women who became abbesses. Powerful abbesses of double monasteries, like Whitby, were figures of immense authority, managing vast estates, overseeing both male and female monastic communities, and even participating in church councils. These women, through their religious vocation, found a path to public leadership and administrative power that was otherwise denied to most women in secular society. However, this was a specific religious path, not a general right available to all women. For the vast majority of Anglo-Saxon women in 700, had their lives unfolded outside the formal public sphere, their voices largely absent from the legal and political forums that shaped their world. This exclusion was a fundamental restriction limiting their access to power and their ability to directly influence the laws and decisions that governed their society. Number 2. Restrictions on divorce and remarriage, especially for widows. Imagine a situation where, even if your marriage was deeply unhappy or if you were suddenly widowed, your ability to determine your own future, to separate from your spouse, or to choose a new partner was heavily circumscribed by law, custom, and the interests of others. This was the complex and often restrictive reality for Anglo-Saxon women in 700 AD regarding divorce and remarriage. While marriage was a contract and divorce was technically possible, the terms were often far less favorable for women, and their subsequent choices, particularly for widows, were frequently not their own. This lack of full autonomy in such critical life decisions was a significant restriction on a woman's personal freedom and future. For women, initiating a divorce was a much more precarious undertaking than for men. While some early Anglo-Saxon laws, like those of King Ainu of Wessex, did outline provisions for divorce, the grounds were limited and the financial consequences could be severe for a woman. For example, if a husband and wife separated, the law often stipulated how property should be divided. However, a woman who initiated the separation without what was considered just cause could find herself significantly disadvantaged, potentially losing her dowry or her share of communal property. The legal framework of the time tended to protect the husband's rights and the stability of the household, making it difficult for a wife to leave without risking severe economic hardship and social stigma. Her ability to simply walk away from an abusive or unbearable marriage was far more constrained than a man's, who often had greater economic independence and fewer social repercussions for doing so. The situation for widows was particularly fraught with restrictions. While a widow, especially one who had received a morgengifa or dowerland, might possess significant property and exercise a degree of independence, her ability to remarry was not always solely her decision. Her late husband's family and even the king or local lord often had a vested interest in her remarriage, particularly if she was wealthy or of high status. Her lands might revert to her deceased husband's family if she remarried outside their approval, or her children might be taken from her. Powerful families sought to control valuable female heirs and their property, seeing them as assets to be strategically allied through new marriages. A widow, therefore, might be pressured or even compelled to marry a man chosen for her, often a relative of her deceased husband, to maintain alliances or consolidate power. Consider the feelings of a woman who, having endured one marriage, was then faced with the prospect of another, not of her own choosing, but dictated by family interests or political expediency. Her personal desires, her grief, or her longing for independence might be completely overshadowed by the demands of her husband's family or her lord. While some widows certainly managed to live independently and exercise considerable autonomy, particularly if they had reached old age or had grown sons who could provide their mund, for many younger widows the path to remarriage was carefully controlled. Law codes often outlined the fines payable for a woman who remarried without permission from her family or the king, indicating the strong controls placed on her choice. This intricate web of legal and social pressure meant that for many Anglo-Saxon women in 700 AD, the freedom to escape an unhappy marriage or to choose a new partner after widowhood was not a given right. Their choices were often dictated by the economic interests of their families, the political maneuvering of their lords, and the strict societal norms that sought to maintain order and control over valuable assets and lineages. This restriction on their marital autonomy was a profound limitation on their personal liberty and their ability to shape their own futures. Number 1. The valuation of a woman's honor and person as property. Imagine a system where your personal safety, your dignity, and even your very body were considered valuable, not primarily because they were yours, but because they belonged in a legal sense to a male guardian. This was the underlying and pervasive restriction on Anglo-Saxon women in 700 AD. The legal framework that valued a woman's honor and person primarily as property of her male protector. While this system ostensibly offered protection, it simultaneously denied women full personal autonomy, framing offenses against them as offenses against their father or husband rather than against their inherent rights as individuals. This concept is most starkly seen in the laws surrounding wergild and mundbreis. Wergild was a fundamental concept in Anglo-Saxon law, a system of monetary compensation paid to the family of a person who had been injured or killed. It was a way to prevent blood feuds and maintain peace. Every free person had a wergild, a value assigned to their life, which would be paid to their kin if they were slain. For women, their wergild was generally lower than that of men of equivalent social status, unless they were of high birth or of childbearing, age reflecting a different societal valuation. This immediately suggests a differing legal status based on gender, where a woman's life was deemed less valuable in terms of monetary compensation compared to a man's. However, the more profound restriction lay in how offenses against a woman's physical integrity and honor were legally interpreted. If a woman was assaulted, injured, or even kidnapped, the primary legal offense was often considered a breach of her male guardian's mund, his guardianship or protection, or an offense against his property. Payment for such an offense, known as mundbreis, breach of mund, would typically go to the father or husband, not directly to the woman herself. For example, if a woman was abducted, the fine for mundbreis would be paid to her father or husband, reflecting the damage to their authority and possession rather than compensation for the trauma or violation experienced by the woman. Consider the chilling implications of this. It meant that a woman's body and her honor were not seen as inherently her own to defend, but rather as objects under the protection of a man. If that protection was violated, the legal redress was paid to the protector, not necessarily to the violated individual. This reduced a woman's agency in her own defense and positioned her as an object of legal transaction rather than a full legal subject. While this system did provide a measure of protection, ensuring that attacks on women were punished and compensated, it did so by viewing women as property, not as autonomous beings with their own rights and dignities that could be violated. Even in cases of rape, the legal codes of the time often framed the offense in terms of forcible abduction or breach of mund and a violation of a man's property or rights, rather than solely as a crime against the woman's bodily autonomy. Payment for such an act would typically be levied as a fine to the woman's male guardian, often the father, who then decided what happened with the funds. This legal framing stripped the woman of her individual victimhood, redirecting the offense and its compensation to the man who held her mund. This systemic valuation of a woman's honor and person as a form of property, protected by and legally belonging to a male guardian, was one of the most fundamental and pervasive restrictions on Anglo-Saxon women in 700 AD. It permeated every aspect of their legal existence, defining their vulnerability and their recourse to the lens of male authority, and consistently undermining their individual personhood in the eyes of the law. This system, while providing a form of protection in a harsh world, fundamentally diminished a woman's inherent worth and rights, positioning her as an object under the guardianship of a man.